Hey everybody, welcome to the Trinity Podcast. I am not your regular host, Joel Milligan. Joel's out today. I'm Daniel Riddick, one of the pastors here at Trinity, and as always, joined in conversation by a group of great pastors, Daniel Warren, Tommy Carr, Pastor Tom Messer, and we're going to jump into a great conversation today around evangelism and culture. But before we get to that, and I've made a commitment, we cannot spend more than about 90 seconds on this, all right? So we're going to go quick. Last night, and I realize everybody's listening to this a week delayed, but last night as we're recording this, LeBron James set the all-time scoring record in NBA history, quickly igniting a firestorm of the ongoing debate of who is the greatest basketball player of all time, Michael Jordan or LeBron James. Quick question, 90 seconds, whoever wants to answer. Does what happened with LeBron last night move him into
No.
Okay.
Michael Jordan, and it's not close.
All right. All right. Daniel?
He is in the conversation.
Okay.
I'm going to take
right.
the very neutral.
Yeah. Daniel's gonna ride
LeBron
the
said
fence.
he believes he's the greatest basketball player to ever live. Whatever that's worth. He said it last night.
All right, there you go.
So
Well, that takes him down a category in my book because of that. I mean, truthfully, I think if you're going to, by all measurements, you should probably start with Bill Russell if he won 11 NBA rings.
If you want to use the championship.
I don't see how we can compare Jordan with LeBron. It's almost an apples to oranges comparison. And I think if you're going to measure impact, I think you got categories. The Russell thing is a thing by itself. Chamberlain's in a category by himself. He's an anomaly to the whole conversation. What Bird and Magic Johnson did to save the NBA puts them in a different conversation.
Right.
And then you got, I think, LeBron, Kobe, Jordan, that kind of that individual, just pure, who's the best individual basketball player. And even in that conversation, if you put rings and legacy impact, I just don't know how Jordan doesn't come out on top.
My take, I like the generational take because I think it really matters and nobody wants to consider that. I'm going to kind of split the fence a little bit. I think it's arguable that, especially because of the longevity, which I think is a feat in and of itself, that LeBron may have put together the greatest kind of overall career. And then I would say, I think that Jordan is the greatest player on the court. So I think you look at the whole career, I think it's in a league of its own. I think Jordan was the greatest basketball
Here's the thing,
player.
and this is a what if, and this is a podcast, and maybe a little controversy will help us a little bit, right? Yeah. So whatever the reason was, Jordan was playing baseball in the prime of his career, right?
Maybe best left unsaid, but yeah.
Whatever the reason, right? If you put that period back in, and I know that's an if,
right.
It's almost unthinkable in the 2 prime years of his life.
Yeah.
What would the 6 NBA rings look like in that period of time? Would it be 8?
Right.
Probably. And what would a year and a half done?
Of additional
scoring addition.
Yeah. The front office would have made some of their decisions. They would have kept the team together, the coaches, all those things that came out in that documentary. Yeah.
Hey, listen, we'd love to hear your take in the comments below.
Unless you're Cliff Willis,
who is the greatest?
We don't need to hear
the
Cliff's
State of the
take.
Union.
We're not getting into that.
Please, that would be a great lead into counterculture, Christian.
All right, listen, we got a great conversation today.
just
I'm gonna get us into this. I read an article from the Gospel Coalition this week, and so I want to say up front, and maybe I don't know if we have show notes on this podcast, but if we do, we'll put a link to the article in the show notes. But great conversation. The title of the article was "Reaching Our Community in a Post-Christian Culture," and I think it's relevant. It stands on its own in terms of conversation. I think within our church right now, we just began a conversation in a series within our church on evangelism, and so I think from that standpoint, it's kind of doubly impactful because it's kind of where we are in terms of what we're teaching and preaching in our church. The premise of the article is simply this: there was a time well within our lifetimes, everybody at this table and probably the majority of the people listening, where much of evangelism was in part appealing to a shared cultural understanding of faith in Jesus. That's not at all to say that more people were actively following Jesus, but there was likely this kind of rough spiritual and probably even Christian foundation that you could kind of appeal to in the thoughts, minds of people when you're having faith conversations. We fast forward, here we are, it's 2023. I think it is in growing, and more than likely that we now live in a fully formed or forming post-Christian culture that has little familiarity with the message of the gospel, and probably, depending on the generation you're talking to, may even consider faith to be completely irrelevant to their life. And this article in the Gospel Coalition really made a case that there are three key points if we're going to continue to reach a post-Christian culture. I'll give them to you now, and then we'll talk about them. One is this, that it's critically important that if we're going to reach a post-Christian culture, that we demonstrate a countercultural community. The church should be a countercultural community. Number two, the need to reach a post-Christian culture for what they called all-life discipleship. We'll get into that. And then the third one is the significance of a gospel-centered life and ministry. So let's start with the first one, the importance of a countercultural community, and specifically that the organization of the church is a countercultural community. So I'll kind of throw this out there. In what ways should the church community appear countercultural? And in what ways, especially in this time, do you think it's critical that we appear countercultural?
Well, this is a really fascinating conversation, and it's probably really a lot broader. They're important and very broad in a lot of ways. If you look back on, and I have in some graduate work I did a course on that dealt with the ebb and flow in culture when the church and culture has alignment, mm-hmm. and then the church and culture has antagonism to each other, and they tend to, it kind of weaves in and out. An example would be, think in the 60s, the culture went counter to the church. People in the culture that wanted the traditionalism, the things that the culture was moving away for, gravitated to the church. So on one hand, the church was very countercultural, mm-hmm. but it was a positive countercultural, mm-hmm. And people moved towards it. That kind of, in the 80s, it was patriotism, right. People kind of really kind of rallied to that. So when you think about counterculture, today, it's so much around, it's almost the war is at the point of traditional church values, not just cultural values. Things the way we define sex, marriage, gender, all of those very controversial issues. And it takes courage to speak the truth in love into a culture that's very hostile towards traditional, what we'd call traditional biblical values. And so I think here it's the message of the church, not the appearance of the church. Mm-hmm. It's the message of the church that is countercultural, and having the ability to speak that articulately, clearly, compassionately is really a challenge. It's the challenge that we have to do. Mm-hmm.
It's funny you mentioned that side of it, and I was telling the guys before you got here and before we started, I just finished reading The Jesus Revolution by Greg Laurie, and an insight into that Jesus movement in Southern California, and those that were countercultural because they saw in the traditionalism, many of them, the hypocrisy of their parents, came out the presence of Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon had been lying about what was going on in Vietnam, that they were so disillusioned by everything. Mm-hmm. So they were looking for counterculture, and they were finding it in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then these, particularly the Calvary Chapel, they begin to, hey, you can find forgiveness and hope and purpose in the gospel of Jesus. and they were drawn to the countercultural message of, we're not looking for you to dress away, act away, be away. You're looking for something that conservative nor liberal can give. We're not a subculture. We are a counterculture, a third way. And they reached tens of thousands of the countercultural movement. And so we see over and over again, the church is able, through the message of the gospel, to reach people in their desires, whether it's I'm left wing, right wing, whatever. Neither one of those at the end of the day satisfies. And I think that's what's so important, the acceptance and the anchor of truth, both grace and truth have to be, and that's what allows us to be counterculture, because culture goes all grace or all harsh truth.
You know, the Calvary culture movement, the Jesus movement, which the Calvary culture came out of, was really the first big non-denominational movement. And so therefore it was almost by default, it was the first appearance of non-institutional Christianity. And, you know, think how institutional Christianity reacted a lot more to the things you mentioned, you know, the dress, hair standards, the trappings kind of thing. And, you know, Calvary Chapel found this sweet spot. They had just literally the worship in the Word and deep relationships, and they simplified church, and it was a much more come as you are culture. Right. And man, that had just enormous impact on church up to 1960. Had not changed, and it looked largely the same in every context. Jesus movement changed it, and church has been changing rapidly since then.
I literally on lunch break finished the book, and I was just like, it's fascinating. And I was telling the guys, moving, challenging. How do we embody that countercultural? What is God doing? How can we get out of the way and see Him do that again in that spirit of evangelism, prayer, revival? I've
had occasion to be with Lowry. He is a fascinating individual, and I would say, at least from my perspective in the context of I met him, he clearly has the touch of God on his life, the ability to communicate, because I don't think he's ever been tainted by the confines and structure of institutional Christianity. And he's probably as close to a modern day Billy Graham, a 2023 version of Billy Graham as there is.
Tommy, I'd like to hear you talk about this. Why would, and I don't think we have the spirit of this is not to be attractional in the way that we do evangelism or ministry, but why do you think a church that does live in the way of Jesus counterculturally to the kind of movement of the kingdom of this world, why would that be attractive to a post-Christian culture?
You know, when we started talking about this discussion, so I see this probably on different levels, and I think it's probably the most complex thing we've talked about probably since we started doing the podcast. And if not, we're being too simplistic in the way we look at it. So this countercultural idea, when we first said the word, it's like we pick out something people do, and that's what we're against. So Jesus is the original counterculture. Like, so he came into the area and they're like, but this man speaks like nobody else. And he said, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. So there's the countercultural move of Jesus in his time. When I get to a certain age, counterculture means we are at war with culture. We're no longer presenting the truth of Jesus. We're going after people's behaviors, the way they look, the way they act, the way they dress. And so what happened in the 70s and 80s, which y'all made fun of me earlier, they said,
we
Tom,
did not. Only one guy that made fun of me.
So Tom, they called the 70s my best years. I'm like, that's not accurate. Whatever you said, that's prime time. 80s were prime time. Right. But what we ended up doing, we went to war with culture. It wasn't the message we were offering was counterculture. The behavioral system we were presenting was countercultural. And so countercultural became a moving target. So then something new would come out, and that's what we're against. And something new came out, and that's what we were against. Right. Until finally, I think a lot of people that were close to Christianity, like I was, we just went, we're done. So now we're on the flip side. Now we're using words, why would that be attractional?
Yeah.
And I'm always disturbed with the word attractional. It's like seeker friendly. One of my favorite writers, he said there was only one seeker in the world and they killed him because he came to seek and to save that which was lost. And so the word attractional to me is a little bit of a struggle. I think we should present the gospel the way Jesus did, as an alternative way, not to just act, but to be, and to be fundamentally different. That's what's countercultural. When you say, listen, we're going to talk about love. We're going to talk about peace. We're going to talk about long suffering. Here's what your pastors should be. Your pastor should be the example of countercultural. So Tom, by definition from the scripture, should be gentle. He should be patient. He should be, that's countercultural to leaders in the world. And so for me, countercultural is less about behavior and attraction than it is internal. Jesus has changed me, and that's different than the world around you. Yes.
Well, so
I think his message and character is really important. And even that character gets into, the idea that, the world's going to say, hey, love everybody, what the world needs is love. Okay. Well, then the world's going to define love. Our definition of love is going to look radically counter to that cultural thing. And it is character and message. And the character of the church and the message is what that's where the focus needs to be. And, obviously it's, I can think of hundreds of different influences. I think Wiersbe wrote the great book on integrity in the church, and he kind of sounded a very early warning and almost prophetically predicted the crisis of what we see today. And not just the church, but institutions have lost influence in society. And the problem when that happens is this: they are what give us roots. And I have to remind myself sometimes, I like to think, hey, we have a big campus, that gives us roots, or we have a lot of ministry, that gives us a lot of roots, or what gives us roots is we have a timeless message, a message that's true. It was true 100 years ago, it's going to be true 100 years from today. And the parts of that are eternal and unchanging, that's what makes us counter to the culture.
Right. And if we're not, and I love what you say there. So kind of continuing what I was saying. So, and I don't mean to introduce like things that you're going to go, that's not right. But so what happened is I know it. I'm good. So the trap you get into if you just become a countercultural organization is you end up drawing lines that aren't biblical.
Right.
They're just countercultural.
You have to redraw
And
lines.
here's where we lose credibility. Then we come back years later and go, we were actually wrong about drums. We were actually wrong about this. We were actually wrong. We over-prioritized this.
Right.
We were so interested in being countercultural that we became unchristian. And it lost credibility. So that's why I struggle with attractional. It's a timeless message. We lean into that, and that's our stance. Regardless of what's happening in culture, that message will always be countercultural.
just to dig a little deeper on this, and then we're gonna move forward. I lifted a quote out of this article in the Gospel Coalition. I'll read it to you. That the church is, this is a concluding point, should be experienced as the family of our Heavenly Father, not primarily as an entertainment show, vendor of religious services, a nonprofit, a classroom, an affinity group, or a corporation. Certainly this phrase is not original with me, but read it, seen it talked about. The idea that cool church, which very much was a real thing, and I would say even maybe to whatever degree we want to acknowledge it, that had influence in the way we were shaping ministry for,
I think cool church is still a thing. It's yet to be proven if it's an effective thing.
Well, the phrase that I'm about to say is that cool church is dying. And there's been a lot written, and some people have said cool church is dead. And my question would be, I don't want to make an assumption about your perspectives on this. Is that a good thing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Can you do me a favor? And this will be fun. We never do this on the
Yeah.
podcast. Define when you're talking cool church, what is cool?
Well, I mean, I'm not looking at a definition that I'm pulling
I mean,
from
just
somewhere.
in your mind.
I think in the context of the conversation we're having, it would be the cool church would be highly stylized. In other words, so on the surface, we're trying to make it, all the buzzwords that were real big in ministry. We're trying to be relevant.
Right.
We're trying to be attractional. That's the word. And I'm not even disparaging it in that I think it was an effective evangelistic and discipleship movement for decades. I think as we move into a post-Christian culture, it is on the decline. and or maybe you could say that it's been, hijacked away from less on it's more about the surface and the show than it is about the substance and the in the community. And so I guess the question is, if that's not the thing, what should we be pursuing in the world that we live in today?
That's good.
Well, yeah, I would add one thing. I think I think a lot of the cool church and the desire, temptation people have had to try to emulate it is there's a lot of personality in the cool church. Mm-hmm. And when you say stylist, I think it even gets into the personality of who's leading it. The opposite of that is, and I'm hesitant to say this because I don't really want to sound like, oh, well, all those people are bad and we're so good because Jesus has to be more important than anything. The gospel has to be more important than anything. People have to matter. And so what you're really thinking about when you think about the opposite of cool church, it's not traditional. It's not
church.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
It's actually, pushing the gospel in to every dimension of life. And it's allowing the message of the gospel, the relationships that you're being built, the mission that you're on collectively as a church to be the driving force and the compelling dynamic of the church, not lights, music. I think those things are trappings, and I think you should do what works. And if you're doing a different style of music and you're on mission and you're preaching the gospel and you're building deep community and you're impacting it makes no difference to me what the style is.
That's why I asked the question. It's like, to me, the primacy of the word, that is the primary thing and the primary message of Jesus. Everything else you support it with, depending on the kind of church you're in. There's some lights, there's some haze, there's not. There's stained glass windows. When you said cool, we took our kids up to New York years ago and we went to one of the big cathedrals. And it's been around since. They went to me, this is really cool. And I'm like, so is that cool church? Yeah. So if we're not careful, but I think what happens a lot of ministries during that period, that became what they were known for, not the message. That became, hey, this is what we're doing in these areas. This is how cool our system is. And that the cool part almost replaced the primacy of the message, the primacy of the word, the adherence to the word of God. And so I'm reminded of a story. A group of American men went overseas, right, to hear the great preacher of London, which was not Charles Spurgeon. It was another man at the time. So they went to go see him that morning. And all these men, Americans, came out, went to lunch. And one of the guys said, it must be said, that man is the greatest preacher in the world. They all agreed. And they said, well, let's go back tonight and hear him. And one of the guys said, no, I'd rather go hear Spurgeon. Let's just go hear him. We've never heard him. So they leave Spurgeon's meeting and they said, it must be said, Jesus Christ is the greatest Savior in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's what the church, the trappings is nothing. But if you walk out of a service and you go, Jesus is the greatest Savior in the world, we're not trying to be cool.
Right.
And the style over substance, I think, is the question. Mm-hmm. And you can have style and substance. That's not a problem. But when you become, I think that's the criticism of cool church, just like the stereotypical cool kids. Yeah. All the style, but they weren't real. They weren't good people. That's the stereotype that I think at least comes to my mind. The guys that beat me up in high school, or whatever. I was a good marching band. Yeah, so all that stuff. But I think that is the trapping of when my style and how I do this is more important than what I'm trying to communicate. I want to leverage whatever tools I can to reach the people God's called me to reach. Mm-hmm. But when the tools become what I'm dependent upon, then that to me, and I think that's what's dying. Because it's not style. Some of the guys that are the biggest proponents, we're killing cool church. They are still spending millions of dollars on production. They just are doing it so that it looks very authentic and homey rather than flashy. But their production budget is still huge. So it's not they're not doing production. They're just trying to do it where it looks a little more authentic and organic. It's not that. It is really, I think, where's the power? Where do you think your effectiveness comes from?
I think, Tom, you've said this before, and you can elaborate on this way better than I would be able to, but you've taught us for years and years, you have to build a life that has a foundation so it won't collapse on itself. And I think what's happening with Cool Church, it's built everything up here, but it's now collapsing on itself. There's not enough substance. There's not enough depth. There's not enough of that. So the trappings are actually what is killing. It's
or
pushing.
the culture doesn't. As the culture shifts, what was cool is no longer cool.
I talked to a guy today that just retired. He's pastored a large church for a long time, just retired recently, and he made a really interesting observation. He said, and he's only been out like a month, and he said, looking back on it, there's such a fine line between thinking I'm trying to get a lot of people to come. Big attendance is the thing. And he said, when you're trying to keep your attendance up and you're thinking about that, he said, you think that is the same as making disciples, staying on mission, multiplying, because growth kind of gives you that. Big gives you that. And then he says, here I'm a month away and thinking, man, I did a whole lot more about getting people to come to church, not helping people become Jesus. Multipliers. Yeah, right. And I mean, and he's a great pastor. I think he probably's done it way better than anybody I know, so I'm not being critical of that. But I think that just kind of gets into the reality that, sometimes you think, hey, we're healthy by what barometer, what measure,
Right.
Well, that actually is kind of a great segue. Here's the second item, again, from this article, Reaching Our Community in a Post-Christian Culture, the need for all-of-life discipleship. So I'm going to throw out a question which will kind of unpack this a little bit. Why should we, and those believers who are listening, reject the cultural dichotomies of sacred or secular, that our life should be public and private, spiritual and physical? In other words, why is it important that we tear down the walls between Sunday and Monday through Sunday?
Because if we don't, that is the problem with so many, and why we've lost credibility, because so many people live in this dichotomy. Who I am on Sunday is not who I am Monday through Friday. And that's why, in not every case, but many times that's why parents lose their kids, because they're not real and they put on a pretense when they come to church. Sunday and I think that's just so hard. Bob Jones Sr. used to say, for the believer, there is no sacred and secular. Everything is sacred. All ground is holy ground. And we have to embrace that. There's no part of my life that God should not claim, and that I shouldn't yield to him. And I think that is the countercultural message. Otherwise, we're just showing up for the show and putting on our Sunday best and pretending everything is good.
How does this picture of discipleship keep us out of the two ditches, which I actually think are growing? We live in a really polarized world right now. Everything, I hate to say right and left because that means political. I'm just there's sides to everything. Every issue, religiously, spiritually, socially, relationally, like there's two very extreme and usually loud. They tend to dominate 80% of the discourse. I think if you get into the context of where is Christianity in the Western world and the American world, maybe even narrow that even a little bit further, evangelicalism, which would be broadly a part of, there actually is a real, I think, uptick and rise in both a progressive, and I don't mean that politically, but I mean it more theologically, Christianity, as well as kind of what I would call a rise in a real fundamentalist movement as well. And I've heard you teach about this many times, there are dangers in the extremes of assimilation to culture and isolation. Talk about that. And talk about how all of life discipleship keeps us out of the ditch.
Well, yeah, so what we have I think what we probably have a tendency to do is we become reductionist, we become simplistic. And in reductionist thinking or simplistic thinking, like when you get to the idea of separation, if the world is evil the further I get away from the world, the better I am. And so if I don't do worldly things, then the world can't hurt me. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem is the world can get you. It's a system. It's not it's not a physical thing. And so, I mean, it can get in the church, it can get in the family's home. Pastors' kids,
principalities and powers.
Yeah. So you can't be simplistic and reductionist about it. And I think the other part, when you get to the whole life discipleship, is that we're trying to help people to integrate biblical truth. And when I say integration, let me be real clear that the unchanging truth of God has to become real to the person. And through the power of the Holy Spirit, they actually begin to live that out. And so they don't stop short. I mean, I just had a marriage counseling conversation this week. And I mean, the guy goes to church and he treats his wife horribly. And he justifies what he's doing because he's not letting what he says he believes to integrate into his life, and I feel badly for her and trying to give her some help on how to protect herself from his horrible behavior and how you can confront that kind of thing in the right way. And there's just, I think if I said, hey, I believe this, and this, he'd say, I believe that, and that.
Right, yeah.
It hasn't showed up in the way he treats his wife, kids, finances, the way he views his responsibility, and that's the problem.
So it's interesting you use those two words, and I agree with everything you just said right there. But that idea of the difference between the extreme of assimilation and isolation, right? So the Bible's really clear. You're in the world, but you're not of it. So we're not to be assimilated, to be part of the world. But it also says, if I didn't need you here, you would have come out of the world. I would have just had needs brought you out of the world.
Salt and light.
Right. You'd be salt and light in the world. So the example in the road, not in the ditches, is Jesus. And I think by the time this airs, we've just recently taught about the call of Levi, the call of Matthew, right? So you find him at the tax collectors, calling him, and Matthew goes, this is great. Let me bring all my friends to my house, which they would have been other tax collectors, likely prostitutes, likely sinners of Matthew's character level at that point. And the next picture we see is, and Jesus was reclining, and the religious crowd was mad because he wasn't isolating. He wasn't in isolation. So I think the clarity for me is how do we in a world not assimilate but not isolate? I think we've done the isolation game and we found out that didn't work, because eventually you get a job, you go to a secular university, you go to a football game,
Right.
And the other extreme doesn't work as well. So I think the ultimate example for us, the way we've done our family, is I want to prepare you so well that when you encounter the world, you've got the truth of Jesus in your heart so deeply that it will not assimilate you. But do not isolate. You become no good to the world at that point.
The last point here, and we'll kind of wrap up with this, reaching a community in a post-Christian culture. They said it's critical that we stand, preach, teach the gospel, and that we live a gospel-centered life and in ministry. I can't speak for everybody listening to this podcast, but in the church world, in the ministry world that we live in, if going back, like we talked about earlier, if going back 15 years ago and 20 years ago, the buzzwords and the catchphrase was relevancy, and being relevant.
It's probably your prime time.
Prime time. That's right, Tommy. I would say it would not be a stretch to say that in the last, decade or so, the idea of gospel-centeredness, which I think we're all about to affirm very strongly, but has become a little bit cliche, and you see, depending on who you read and what you follow, you just see, that phrase attached to everything. How to have a gospel-centered lunch, how to go, everything to where it almost means nothing. But I think it does mean something, and I think the point of that article is critical. And so I guess my question is this: how would you define what it means to be gospel-centered, and then how does that play into reaching our community in a post-Christian culture?
So recently I saw a post, we shouldn't water down the gospel. And then it was followed up, if it was a sin 20 years ago, it's still a sin today. Don't water down the gospel.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, you don't understand what that means. Because the gospel is We are sinners. We are guilty before God. Jesus, the good news, the gospel, Jesus came to pay the price for our sin. He died the death that we should have done, satisfied the wrath of God. He would then made a way for us to be forgiven. Then he rose from the dead to give us and make a way for us to have eternal life. Not only am I forgiven, but I now have eternal life with God forever in heaven through Jesus. That's the gospel. And that message cannot change. It has to be the primary thing that we trumpet. Mm-hmm. And for me to be gospel-centered, I recognize the only hope I have is not in my good works. I'm never trying to earn God's grace. It is only through Jesus Christ that I experience the love, forgiveness, and grace of God. And that's keeping that at the center. And then, to me, gospel-centered in my relationships, the same way, if you offend me, the same way that I offended God, I offer forgiveness to you, because we should forgive one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven us. Mm-hmm. Keeping all of that at the center, to me, too often, like that one post that I saw, they're equating some of those culture wars with the gospel.
Right.
It was a sin 20 years ago, and my answer to that is, you're absolutely right. And I don't really think it was a sin 20 years ago, because if it's not a sin today, it would have been a sin. Right. It would still be if it was absolute. Yeah. Maybe it was a line we drew in the sand. So I do think keeping the gospel at the center is so essential.
Yeah, I don't want to go way deeper than this than we need to. I'll just give a couple things. I grew up in a very balanced church. There was no cultural legalism to speak of. That doesn't mean that there was unhealthy things. In every church there is. I mean, God knows that in our churches things I think at times we shouldn't do that, or and it's hard to. But I did not grow up. In other words, the fundamentalist sins, the mixed swimming, the long hair.
That wasn't a part of your.
That wasn't part of my upbringing culture. Going to movies. I mean,
it was actually mixed bathing.
Mixed bathing, whatever. See, I'm just so it's foreign. I mean, we went to movies because it was about the only thing to do entertaining wise.
Right.
That you could.
Not a lot happening up Massachusetts.
Yeah. So, and when I came here, even my college experience, I was really exposed to it. And within a few years of pastoring, Lisa and I talked about this very extensively the other day. We just kind of retelling this story and working through kind of how the Lord was working in our lives. By the early 2000s, I was like, what we're doing is not going to work forever. It is actually built on a cultural model, not a deeply spiritual model. And, again, I don't want you to think I'm trying to put myself in a good light. I just felt like do it or die. And it was hard. And, there's a lot of people that aren't here because they couldn't make the journey. And I don't think that makes them bad people. They bought something that we stopped selling. Yeah. And the hardest part for me in the early 2000s was I didn't have language. I didn't have vocabulary for what I was feeling and thinking and trying to do. I didn't get that language until I got exposed to the idea of gospel-centeredness. And it's not that, when I found it, it was not like, oh, that's what I've been looking for. That's what I was aiming at all along. I just didn't have language and vocabulary. And, there's a lot in that. And so now I would say for the last, probably since 2003 or 4, which is going on 20 years, I've really slowly, incrementally kind of wrapped my mind around it. So a week ago, Friday, I was scheduled to speak in College Chapel. I was really wrestling. What am I, these kids hear me. It's, I'm in chapel every Friday. I know what every message is. It's just like, what short of, God turning you into, the Apostle Paul in a 30-minute chapel said, what are you going to do? And so I just literally went in there and taught on gospel-centered living. And picking up on what you just said, I said, here's the implications of that. That tells you that gospel-centeredness is upside-down living. Jesus left heaven and came to earth. And everything you see in the Bible points you to this paradoxical, first shall be last, or the last shall be first. The way up is down. You know, you don't get even. You forgive. Just the paradoxical nature. That's the upside down nature of the gospel. The atonement, that part of the gospel, Daniel explained about both. We're equally sinful and loved at the same time. There's the perfect blending together of grace and justice. The justice of God is satisfied, and the grace of God makes the payment for on the justice of God and frees us. So that says that the gospel is inside out. So your whole life, first of all, it's got to be upside down. It's got to be inside out. You don't, spirituality can't get into the inside of you from the outside. There's nothing you're going to do or perform to get it. It's inside out. And then because of the resurrection, the gospel is always forward back, which means we don't live tied to our past, or we don't live subject to what's happening in the present. We live in light of the fact that the future reality of the resurrection rectifies and restores a fallen and broken world. And so what is happening to me today does not define me. What defines me is that one day I'm going to be at the throne of God, blameless and faultless, without sin before him. And I am going to look back and view everything in my life through the lens of what Jesus was doing in my life. And, you know, it's funny. I could talk about it. I mean, I could talk about it for an hour, right? And I did it with those kids in chapel, and I probably had the most interaction with them that I've ever had, because there's a hunger and an appetite in their life that it's not moralism, it's not performance, I'm not defined by the best day of my life, I'm not defined by the worst day of my life, I'm not defined by how well I performed today, I'm not defined by how I failed today, I'm not defined by what people think about me, I'm defined by the fact that I am made new in Jesus Christ. And that changes everything. And when that breaks into your life, it frees you from so much. You know, it just really makes a radical difference.
Yeah, that gospel center, like that's a difficult, because you're right, it's so cliche. And I've heard preachers all over the country here, and you go, gospel centered life. Man, it's just a difficult concept, which all explains great. For me, it's this idea of the gospel has a continual working in my daily life. Although there's a punctiliar nature of justification, it's a one time and it's sealed. The gospel still has this sanctifying presence. And so for me, a gospel-centered life is the salvation and the justification, the punctiliar nature of that still has a continual progressive work in sanctification. And so the gospel is working out so that I'm living upside down. The gospel is working its life out in me because I do be forgiving when I don't want to be forgiving. He that'll be great, let him be your servant. There's that gospel-centeredness that a punctiliar event has a progressive sanctification throughout my life, and that is the gospel working itself out in my life.
It's not just the diving board, it's the pool.
It is the pool.
There you go.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, guys, I've enjoyed the conversation, and I think it's a good, healthy conversation about what it looks like to live out the way of Jesus in a post-Christian culture. And I hope you, if you've been listening with us today, have enjoyed that. Thank you for listening to the Trinity Podcast. Wherever you're listening, let me encourage you to leave a review, to like, to subscribe. If you're watching on a social media channel, to share it as well. And we'll see you next week.